On this unceded and unsurrendered territory where we live and work, peace and friendship treaties were signed between 1725 and 1779 by the Elnu, the Wolastoqiyik, the Passamaquoddy First Nations, and the British. These peace and friendship treaties were among the earliest treaties to be made between Indigenous nations and Western nations. Despite the efforts of the Canadian government since Confederation to assimilate and erase Indigenous peoples through government policies such as the Indian Act and the Residential Schools Act, the resilience of Indigenous peoples has meant that Indigenous traditions continue to influence the Canadian political, social, cultural, and environmental landscape today.
Thank you, Allison. Now we'll go over to Ben to tell us about the series.
Thank you. This guest lecture series is sponsored and made possible by the Sheila Hugh Mackay Foundation. It's organized by the Advanced Studio Practice Program at the New Brunswick College of Craft and Design in partnership with the Atlantic Center for Creativity. The purpose of the guest lecture series is to model successful contemporary practice to our students and to inform, inspire, and ignite art and design dialogue and engagement in the greater public community. The guest lecture series provides this by giving a platform for presentation, creating time for dialogue, and by celebrating the creative and cultural riches that we hold in Atlantic Canada.
Thanks, Ben. Now over to Audrey to tell us about our partner.
The Atlantic Center for Creativity is an initiative that promotes creativity across disciplines. It has three main goals. One, to promote research and programming in the area of creativity and innovation. Two, to offer events such as symposia, conferences, and workshops on a yearly basis for sharing ideas and information. And three, to build partnerships in the area of creativity and innovation on a local, regional, and national basis. You can get additional information and check out the online journal Creativity Matters by visiting the website atlanticcenterforcreativity.com.
Thanks, Audrey. And now we'll go over to Joe for our introduction of the guest speaker.
This talk is about exploration, investigating change, embracing the new, and what if of practice. Jackie Bourque has a diploma in textiles from NBCCD and has been weaving for 30 years. She is an instructor of weaving at NBCCD, in addition to having a vibrant studio practice. Her production involves hand-dyed woven and silk scarves, as well as conceptual gallery exhibition work. Jackie's work was selected for the Beneath the Surface Fundy National Park Residency. The photos she created were exhibited in 4 locations in New Brunswick: Fredericton, Sussex, St. John, and Restigouche. Over to Jackie.
Hi, welcome. I'm going to get right to it. Exploring possibilities, and one of them apparently is dealing with new technology and how awful that is for some of us, so I apologize once again, and embracing change. So here is where I grew up. I grew up on the banks of the Wolastoqiyik River. My father was a farmer, and I was the second of 4 children. Growing up, we were what you would call free-range children, and we had the farm, the outbuildings, 200 acres of pasture as our playground. I learned how to garden, how to judge risks, how to be independent, and how to solve problems while playing on the farm. I learned basic knitting, crocheting, and sewing from my mother, who was a talented maker. I took art in high school. I really loved all my art classes, but did not see it as a way to make a living. So I decided to become an accountant because accountants make lots of money. When I graduated, I went to UNB and enrolled in business administration to become an accountant. I really did well in my elective classes, but the accountant classes were, for the most part, dry, boring, awful. I did not do well in those, and my university career did not end well. So I asked myself, what if I tried something different? I really don't remember how I heard about the craft college, or the craft school it was called, as it was called back then, but I applied to take photography or pottery and was accepted. And this was in the late 80s. During my first year, there was a very good lecture and workshop series. They were hosted on the weekends and started off by a Friday evening slide show and talk, which the first year students were required to attend. One of the presenters that came that September was a weaver named Randall Darwell. One of my classmates had come to the college specifically to take weaving, and I remember thinking, why would anybody want to take weaving? During a slide presentation, he showed images of beautiful, luxurious, richly colored woven items, and I was intrigued. And after the slide presentation, he literally threw a handful of scarves into the audience, and I got my hands on one, and feeling the silk and looking at the colors and the textures, it became immediately apparent to me, this is why someone would want to take weaving. And so I ended up taking textiles. I really enjoyed all of my classes in college because I enjoyed trying new things, but I was still drawn to pottery. So in my third year, I took the Intro to Clay class, which was a full day back then. When I graduated with honors from textiles, I returned for one more year to take what was then called first year clay. For our graduation documents, we had to write an artist statement, and to all the students, it was as painful for me as it was for you, but it does get easier. My artist statement reads, knowledge and exploration are very important to me. I always try to learn something new, whether it be a different technique or the use of a newfound material. Because each piece is a fresh start, each is open to different interpretation and experimentation. I cannot limit myself to one aspect of art, as all hold some interest to me. And we will see how this still holds true. After I graduated, I really didn't know what I was going to do. I worked many part-time jobs. For a while, my average was 3, and at one time I had 5. I worked at a coffee shop, clothing store, for a framer, fresh produce market, cafe, and a health food store. I had a very busy schedule, and there was not much time or energy left at the end of the day to do very much art. In 1993, I went to England with my younger sister to be the family representative for my older sister, who was graduating from Cambridge University. We were there for about a month, and we were exposed to a different culture. We traveled around and had some adventures. I learned how to drive on the right side of the car, on the right side of the road. I learned that a wool sweater and raincoat were essential wardrobe items. Out of the 30 days that we were there, it rained 28. And we learned that the dead sheep that I found did not die of thirst. Before I left for England, I had met the man who would become my husband. When I got back, we soon started discussing having a family. In 1994, my eldest Vince was born, and life as I knew it changed forever. When he was a baby and a toddler, I had a small room set up as a craft room. I did a lot of sewing, mostly baby clothes, blankets, and quilts. I purchased a small secondhand loom and started weaving again. He was an easy baby and would take 3 or 4 hour naps in the afternoon, allowing me to work after finishing off my household to-do list. I often say that he lulled me into a false sense of security because we decided to do it again. In 1997, Simon and Liam came along, and all craft things came to a grinding halt as I dealt with 3 small children. My craft room became the twins' bedroom. The loom went into storage, and my craft area was reduced to 1 drawer in the kitchen, a very high shelf in the closet in the boys' bedroom, and the top of my dresser. But as you can see, it wasn't all bad. We did have some fun with the babies. I also made myself a small tapestry loom that could hang on the back of the kitchen door. This is a small tapestry of a drawing by Vince. In 2000, Vince was in kindergarten and the boys started a preschool 3 mornings a week, and I was asked by the then head of the textile department, Linda Brine, if I would become a technician. It was 2 or 3 half days a week, and so I was able to drop the boys off at play school, go to work, pick them up on the way home. During this time, I saw a spinning instructor give a 30-second demo on drop spindling, so I borrowed a drop spindle and learned how to spin. Also, at some point during this time, my weaving teacher, Susan Judah, gifted me with a small loom that was foldable. This has been one of the greatest gifts that I have ever been given, as I could tuck it into a corner when I wasn't weaving and pull it out when I had time. I call it my heirloom, and it is still in use today. During this time, I also took some classes in basketry, needle felting, dyeing yarns, and started learning the weaving design software. I'd also started doing some Christmas craft sales with my weaving group. I was still working part-time, so I would weave in the evenings and when the kids were playing. I also started making things for sale during the summer months. I moved my heirloom to the sun porch in the backyard so that I could keep an eye on the kids while they were outside playing, and sometimes I was interrupted quite often. Selling with a group is a great way to access some of the larger sales around town without having enough stock to fill a booth. Sharing costs, pooling resources, and splitting times for manning the booth made being at sales possible. In early 2003, I found out that another baby was on the way, surprise, and finished working at the college that spring. Nicole arrived in late September, and she was an easy baby, so when everyone else was in school, I was able to get some weaving done for Christmas sales. I still wasn't able to fill a booth by myself, and was very thankful for the support of my weaving group. In the summer of 2006, I started doing a weekly Saturday market that went from June until December. I did this market for 3 or 4 years. I was always looking for something new to put on the table, so anytime that I found something that was small, could be easily interrupted, and that might be saleable, I would try it. Nicole started to go to play school in 2006, and I started working full 3 days a week. I hired my mother to watch the kids after school and play school. At this time, the textiles department had just hired a new teacher, Denise Richard, and I was introduced to wet felting. This piece is a combination of needle felting and wet felting. Needle felting is made by poking a barbed needle repeatedly into wool fleece. You can get very sculptural as you have a lot of control over where you place the fleece. This hand lived on the top of my dresser out of reach of small hands. I would often give myself a timeout, go to my room, jab furiously at this until I felt calm enough to go back to deal with the kids again. Fun fact, the more you poke the fleece, the harder the object gets, and this hand is very firm. In 2007, a spinning wheel found its way to my doorstep, and I began spinning quite a bit based on my drop spindling experience. This usually was in the evening when we were watching movies as a family. I will be honest that I enjoyed the excuse that no one could sit on my lap while I was spinning. I was told it was very good luck to keep your first skein, so I decided to weave myself a scarf with it. I still enjoy spinning and making hand-spun woven scarves today. In 2008, I became a technician for the fashion studio just 1 day a week, during which I mostly did regular machine sewing maintenance. I also took a sewing class, a surface embellishment class, and learned more dyeing techniques, as well as screen printing. I love taking classes because you always learn something new. It's also great to be given an assignment when you're struggling to come up with projects to do on your own. The inner child leaf pillow was my response to the assignment to make a pillow using some of the techniques that I had learned. So I'm still learning and satisfying my needs for exploration of new techniques and materials, and thinking of surface embellishment, I pick up my beading needle and start beading felt vessels. Both Volcano and Buoy were felt vessels that were felted over a flat pattern. The beads on Volcano were added and followed the natural creases that formed when I created the vessel. Buoy has knotless netting and beads as embellishment. They were both submitted for the 500 Felt Objects book, and both were accepted. Sometimes we say no to an opportunity because we're not quite sure how we're going to complete it. So I wondered what would happen if I said yes and then figured it out later. In 2009, I got a call from Brigitte Clavette asking me if I would make something for a show called Rock, Paper, Scissors. The catch was that it needed to be something made of paper. I hesitated for a moment as paper was not something that I normally worked with. Then I thought, what if I say yes? I did, and then I was told that the timeline was quite short. So I made some samples. I found that kinwashi paper with Elmer's art paste over a balloon worked well. The problem was with the shape of the balloon. And then I remembered an episode of MASH where they blew up surgical gloves and thought, why not a condom? Those will stretch. So I blew up a condom and hung it over my kitchen table. I dyed the paper, printed the leaves with the screen that I had made for my leaf pillow. I cut out a lot of leaves. The leftover bits that were between the leaves I used for the base layers of my sample. For my sample, I knew that I needed between 5 and 7 layers of paper to get something that was sturdy enough to do what I wanted. Every evening I would put a layer of paper on and then wait for it to dry until the following evening, or I'd put the next layer of paper on. So this growing green condom hung over my kitchen table for about a week. I have found that a lot of time my work is created in response to invitation to group shows. Just like making production weaving to sell, for the longest time I didn't have enough time to create a body of work for a solo show. Most of my time was taken up with dealing with my large and boisterous family and working, so I often created work specifically for shows, and this was one of those pieces. That's Latin. I'm not going to even bother trying to pronounce it because I'll murder it, but it's Latin for genetically modified fruiting bodies. This was for a craft NB show where the theme was otherworldly. At the time, there was a lot of uproar about genetically modified foods, so I created a fruiting body that looked familiar in some ways, but in other ways totally unfamiliar. There was a lot of problem solving that went into the creation of this piece. I had to figure out how to make these spheres and orbs that were not going to collapse, how to create a multi-branched fruit, and how to attach all of these things. I continued to enter into group shows. Some entries were accepted and some were rejected. But there came a time when I did not find very many calls for shows that I was interested. And so I decided, what if I gave myself the assignment? So in January 2012, I decided that I would make one felt vessel for each month and have it based on a theme of something that had sparked my interest that month. Shown here are February and April. In February, the sun is starting to come back and we're looking forward to a winter's end. It always seems to be the longest and coldest months to me, and so I created fire. April was the lacy mushroom. In April, it actually was exhibited in a felt show in DC. May was inspired by a Spanish dancer's skirt with all the ruffles. 1 month it was the guardhouse. Another one was inspired by the deep water at the lake. One by the address graduation that year that was given by an elder. Spiderwebs and pumpkins, whatever caught my attention. Over the years, I have found myself drawn to certain things over and over again. A lot of times these have become inspirations for me, and I didn't even realize it until I looked back at some of the things that I had created. A very bad photo. I think this was in New York. One of the things that always fascinated me with these long Chinese hand scroll paintings. I find it very intriguing that you can tell a story in one continuous line like that. I always had an idea that I would like to create such a thing, but anytime that I thought about it, it was never with weaving. It wasn't until very recently that I realized that I had already done that. I had created long storylines through weaving. In 2007, the Fredericton arts community lost a well-known and hardworking artist. Charlotte Glenncross was a tapestry artist, a weaver, and an arts advocate. She was instrumental in the creation of the Charlotte Street Arts Center. When she wove tapestries, she mixed many different colors of yarns onto bits of paper that were called quills. There were always some of these quills left over after she finished weaving her tapestries. Charlotte willed me her very large and problematic loom. Large because it took up most of one room in her house, and problematic because it was built without a pattern by a woodworker whose wife wanted to weave. When I went to pick up the loom at Charlotte's house, Charlotte's husband John asked me if I wanted her yarn as well. Of course I said yes, and so a truckload of yarn came home with me. Among the many bags of yarn were a multitude of these quills that still had combinations of yarn on them that were from her hand, her eye, her mind, and her tapestries. I filled a Rubbermaid tote with them. I always wanted to do something with them, but didn't know quite exactly what. It was a bit of a daunting prospect to be using these materials that Charlotte had used to create her tapestries, because how could I possibly create anything as amazing as what she did? In 2011, the Beaverbrook Gallery was having a retrospective of Charlotte's work, and because Charlotte was so influential in the arts community, there were a number of other galleries around town that were having shows that were in honor of Charlotte. My Fiber Arts group was one of them. We decided to have a show called The Thread That Binds. We had a meeting and I brought several bins of yarns that were Charlotte's that people could choose from, so that in all the works there were in the show, there would be some of Charlotte's yarn. I knew that I wanted to create a tapestry with her leftover quills. I also knew whatever I created was not going to live up to her artistry. I put a warp on my heirloom and tried to figure out what I was going to weave. I had just started teaching, which in some cases meant that I had to learn something to keep one step ahead of my students, as the curriculum had been set by someone else. The kids were still young and there was not enough time for me to focus on the weaving. After several false starts and unweaving what I had woven, I decided to wait until we were on Christmas break to actually start so that I could focus. This gave me a very short timeline because the entries were due at the beginning of January. My last day of work was on December 19th. So for the next 10 days, I wove 8 to 10 hours a day, except for Christmas Day when I only wove 4. The plan was to weave until I ran out of something, whether it be time, quills, or warp. It turns out that the gods were smiling on me and I ran out of time about the same time I ran out of quills. I had sorted all the quills into colors, and when I finally figured out what I was going to weave, I just started. I decided to start with green for life and work my way through the rainbow of colors and finish off with white, which in my rhyme represents the spirit world. It was amazing to me how much I learned from her not even being there, but by what she left behind. The way that she dealt with color and blending of colors was really amazing. Skipping ahead a few years, I wove this piece for a show called One on One. It was at the George Fry Gallery. Each studio was asked for an instructor to respond to a work that a student had made. I teach my students how to dye warps, and one of them wanted to really explore this. And so I was doing a whole bunch of different samples of different types of dyeing techniques with natural dye. She was. I decided to make a timeline over 2 years together, starting with the summer that she first started in first year textiles. And with each season, the color changed and reflected the colors normally associated with those seasons. Lots of vibrant colors for the spring, reds and orange for the falls, whites and blues for the winter, and then into spring with some browns and light spring greens. The spring also contained a lot of blue, reflecting all of the flooding that happened. There was one winter that seemed excessively long, and so that winter was a very long, mostly white area. I had to dye both the warp and the weft to mimic these color changes. One image that you see here is on my loom. Another is an installation shot while standing up. The woven cloth was about 40 feet long. It stretched from one side of the gallery to the other, and it was hard to get a good view of the whole thing. So the picture on the bottom is a panoramic that I took while laying on my back on the gallery floor. In 2015, I was extremely fortunate to be able to go to the Fiber Arts Conference in Grossmore National Park in Newfoundland. The main reason for the conference was that I was there to take part in a workshop by Jane Kidd, who was an amazing tapestry artist. It was a small class and tapestry is slow, so even at the end of 3 days, the project was small, but the learning was large. Now a word about workshops. I love workshops and classes and try to take at least one every summer now. These are not always related to weaving or even textiles. Sometimes they are, but I've also taken workshops in bamboo basketry, raku pottery, bookbinding, one called Naive Botany and another called Constructed Surfaces. Workshops are a wonderful place to meet new people, explore new places, listen to new ideas, and learn something new. So this is my first time in Newfoundland. I'd heard so many amazing things about the Newfoundland landscape, but I was still astonished by the park and the vast size of my surroundings. It was one of those delightful times when I felt so diminished by my surroundings that my insignificance in the grand scheme of things was truly apparent. It was a time to take in the large, but focus on the small because the large was really very overwhelming. One of the small things that I absolutely loved was the rocks on the beach. There was a huge variety of them, and I was curious about how some of these rocks came to be in this place together, as they all obviously had different origins. So I go home with this idea of rock and space mulling about in my head. And at the same time, a few friends and fellow artists were talking about making a small collective and doing a group show. So we had a few meetings and sent a proposal to the St. John City Gallery. We got the good news that we had a show in early April. After going through a few ideas and discarded them, I decided to attempt to recreate the Newfoundland beach in Grossmore National Park. To do this, I started with dye samples. I studied pictures of rocks and tried to recreate the colors of the rocks. I figured out how to make rocks look like Newfoundland rocks with their huge amounts of variety through lots of sampling. Once all of the sampling was done, then it just became a matter of doing the grunt work. So for 7 months, I sat in my basement workroom watching videos for 3 or 4 hours a night, 2 to 3 nights a week, making rocks. I started with the rocks because they were the easiest to figure out and they were also going to take the longest time. After all, in my vision, I had about 18 square feet to cover with rocks. While making these rocks, I thought a lot about how I was going to recreate the sense of vastness. My vision was to have a large felted panel that mimicked the landscape. In front, I wanted to have the beach and then water, and then across the water, you would see the mountains and then the sky up above. I made some samples and did some problem solving. Thankfully, I had access to the felting tables at the college, which are only about 6 feet long and less than 4 feet wide. So working with what I had to come up with an idea to create a large panel. And I came back to the idea of the long scroll. There were several felting classes that were happening at the school, and I knew it was not going to be a one-day project. And so I waited until March break before making the attempt. After dyeing all my fleece, I got a large tarp and sketched out the basic color changes on the tarp. I laid out my fleece for the beach and started felting it. Felt is created when wool is wet and then agitated. But wool is also next to impossible to lay out evenly when it's wet. So I left a little bit at the top area that I was laying out that was dry and unfelted, and I wet and felted the part that was closest to me. As I worked, I would roll up the felted part and then lay the next part of my image that I wanted to create. I also had to think about the weight of my finished piece when it was hanging on the wall, so I decided to encase a layer of silk gauze between the 2 layers of fleece. The fleece would work its way through the gauze and bind with the fleece on the other side to create a strong fabric. It was a bit nerve-wracking to do this whole piece because I could only ever see a small portion of my work at a time. So I had to trust myself, trust my sampling, and trust my process. To create the large panel, it was 2 10-hour days of laying out the fleece, felting it, rolling it up, laying out the next bit, and repeating. I was only ever able to see a little more of 2 feet that I was working on, and it was quite a relief when I unrolled this and discovered that I had created what I had set out to create. Here's the final piece installed at the St. John City Gallery. You can see just on the very edge of the photo, there is a doorway, which is about 8 feet high. And so the piece itself is about 9 or 10 feet up the wall. and then 6 feet out. The rocks on it, or the rocks are a portion of the beach that is approximately 6 feet by 3 feet. I still have absolutely no idea how many rocks I made, but I did bring 2 rocks back from Newfoundland and tuck them in there, and people had a fun time trying to find them. At the same time, I've been doing a bunch of cleaning in my workroom, and this had me thinking and wondering about why we collect and why my house is so full of stuff. As a gardener of many years, one of the things that you do when you have an excessive amount of stuff is you can it. So why couldn't I do the same with some of my stuff that I've been saving? Out came some old inherited canning jars that would no longer be safe for storing food. I proceeded to fill them with some things that I had saved. There were random things like receipts and rocks, shells, keys, bits of yarn scraps, among other things. For each of these jars, or in some instances clusters of jars, because for some reason I saved a lot of receipts and yarn bits, I created a small booklet that had the image of the jar on the front of it and then my musings about why I would have saved these things. The booklets hung from chains beside the jars, and I made labels that invited people to read the booklets. There was also an empty booklet and a jar that I invited people to add something that they had been carrying around and write something about it, and I was quite thrilled when a few people did. Here are some of the jars. This was a very introspective project for me. I find it very fascinating the way people's minds work and how everybody is really quite different in what they find interesting or important. So if you bear with me, I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from some of the little booklets. One of them is a jar of inadequacies, insecurities, and self-doubt. And it reads, "We all have them, but why do we hold on to them? I have had them for years, and some I know are delusional and not worthy of my regard, and yet they persist. How does one open the jar and set them free and start to feel worthy?" Some of them were a little bit humorous, like the jar of dryer lint balls. So do you know that dryers make these little lint balls all on their own? Neither do I, but they do. So please take this as a public service announcement to get your dryer cleaned. Another one of my favorites was entitled 27 Random Things from Drawer Number 3. So why do we keep some things? Well, okay, there are some things that are attached to memory or potential. Yes, I have explored some of these, but there are just some random things that get put somewhere to be dealt with later. Digging through the detritus of my past, I find myself wondering how some of these things survived purging, or at least sorting into a more appropriate location, like a garbage can. This is a list of 27 random things that were found in drawer number 3 of my filing cabinet, a cabinet which, I will be truthful, only has files in one drawer. So my enjoyment and admiration for rocks has been well documented so far, and with contents may vary, I had started thinking about my collection of things, and one of the things that I've been collecting for years was rocks. Some of them had been collected because they were pretty or interesting. Others, I wasn't really sure why I'd collected them, but one thing about rocks that I noticed was that they all had certain attributes. When I started to examine these rocks and apply labels to them, I found that there was a similarity to the attributes that some people can have as well. My artist statement for this was, rocks naturally have certain attributes. They can be hard, flaky, or fragile. When an outside force is introduced, they can stand solid or transform into something else, such as protection, toy, or a weapon. I have found similarities in people. As I looked at each rock, certain words came to mind. If a word worked to describe both rocks and people, the letters were applied. Both rocks and people can be crushed. Both can have families, both can feel full of potential. We can be precious or hard or soft, and both can be a gift. One of the hardest things a lot of people have to accept is the possibility of rejection. If you don't apply, then you won't get rejected, but you won't get accepted either, which led to the question, what if I applied? One of the things that I have frequently applied for has been residencies. Residencies can take a variety of number of forms. One kind of residency is that you pay to go somewhere and have access to equipment and instructors and other people. Another one is where you go to a place and you do your work, usually in an area that has public access, so that you can have conversations with people about what you're doing. At the end, you usually get an honorarium, and I've done a number of those. But Beneath the Surface was different. Beneath the Surface was a residency that was the brainchild of Allie Murphy, who is the executive director of Craft NB. Her thought was to take 20 artists and the curator into Fundy National Park for 5 days, take them on some hikes with park interpreters, give them some workshops and presentations, and then over the summer, each artist was asked to create a piece for the show for the fall that was inspired by our time in Fundy. It was an amazing week where we made connections. We learned about the history of the park. We learned about the history of the land in New Brunswick and that area. We spent time together in large groups and small groups. We had meals together. We went on walks. We went on hikes, as well as doing workshops. We really bonded as a group. It was an experience unlike anything I'd ever done before. It was so very enriching. It was amazing. We were asked to come to the park with an open mind, so we didn't have any preconceived ideas about what we were going to be doing for our project. I had no idea what I was going to be doing in the end, so it's open to possibilities. Just before I left for the residency, which was a Monday to Friday in early June, I had a dream in which there was a voice behind me, a presence behind me, and this voice said with such passion and commitment, "I am completely in love with you." And it was so strong and so intense that it woke me up out of my sleep, and I thought, oh, isn't that a lovely way to approach life? I was in the Fundy area for another reason the weekend before, and arrived a day early. I got settled in and went for a walk and found a river. It was a lovely moment, and I started writing these words in the park. This was the first one. It was lightly scarred on a rock by Salmon River with another rock. For another one that same night, I used catkins. Later, I used rocks or sticks and spelled out these words over and over again. At one point, I thought maybe I didn't actually have to spell out the words and that something else could take a placeholder for each letter, and I created this final piece. I still didn't know what I was going to do, so I created multiple samples for several different ideas, including felting some rocks that were different from the ones that I had previously made. The group had a meeting in early July to discuss our initial ideas and get feedback from the group discussion. I showed my ideas, and the ones that people were most excited by were the rocks that I had felted that mimicked the kind of rocks that were found on this beach by Cape and Rage. After coming up with a number of ideas for using the rocks, I eventually decided that this image would be displayed with the felted rocks beneath it. The idea of writing words, leaving positive messages out in the environment felt so good that I started doing it in random places. For example, one day I went for a walk at lunchtime and there were some nice bright red berries that were on black mulch, and I thought that they looked perfect. So I used the berries and wrote out the words. I decided that I wanted to do more of this. I had applied for a couple of grants through Arts NB before and had been rejected, but I decided to apply again to do what I called love notes. My idea was to go around to various places within the Atlantic provinces, PEI, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and write messages of love using natural materials that were found near the site of creation. I would then photograph them and leave the artwork to be returned to nature through nature's intervention of wind, water, and wild things. I got the grant, and over the summer of 2018, I traveled to PEI, Nova Scotia, and Cape Breton, as well as a few places in New Brunswick. For the most part, I traveled by myself and camped in my van. It was quite an introspective time, and I found my thoughts turning inward. I was feeling rather negative about some things in my life and found that to create this original idea with messages of love felt very forced. So instead, I wrote messages of kindness and appreciation. Be gentle with yourself. After the creation, I'd take the photographs and then would walk away. All of the elements that I used were from very close. A lot of the pieces were in tidal zones, or the elements were small and light enough to be disturbed by wind or small animals. As I said, I was pretty much alone for most of this time, and there were some areas, especially in Cape Breton, where there was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, and I was essentially cut off from people that I know and people that knew me. I found myself drawn to capture images of things that were isolated in some way. I didn't realize this until after I'd gotten back and was looking at all of the images that I had taken. I found that the images had this commonality of something alone in the vastness of its environment, much as I had been. In 2019, Craft NB was doing Beneath the Surface again. I had a number of conversations with other people that had been there in 2017, and we all loved the experience so much that we wanted to apply again. But we also wanted other people to have that experience. So I didn't apply. But then about 4 days before the deadline, I had a conversation with Ali, and she said that only 4 people had put their applications in and said, apply if you want. So I quickly put together an application and got it in before the deadline. A lot of other people apparently had waited until the last minute as well, and I ended up being on a wait list. Fortunately for me, unfortunately for them, one person had to drop out because of a work conflict, and so I was once again invited. It was another week full of exercises, walks in the woods, conversations, shared meals, beach excursions. Once again, I had no idea what I was going to do because we were once again told to come with an open mind. While I was there, my husband was at the woodlot and sent me a photograph of a tree that had a target canker on it, asking me if I wanted him to cut it. The tree had lost most of its bark during the winter due to porcupines, we believe, and it was not going to survive the summer. He thought perhaps one of the woodworkers among the group would be interested. I showed them the image, but none of them really seemed to show very much interest. And I had the thought at some point, maybe I could do something with that piece of wood. What if I tried something completely new? Followed quickly by the thought, what if I mess it up? After all, carving wood was something that I really had never done before. It was a really amazing piece of wood that had been carved by Mother Nature. So I cut it down and I gave him a very rough outline of what I thought I would like the back of this thing to do. And he did a rough cut for me with a chainsaw. I didn't want to touch the front at all, just chip away at the back to create something that would support the beauty of the front. And then came 3 weeks of me working with a hammer and chisel under the guidance of mask carver Tim Jones, who was another member of the residency group that year. And getting back to the question, what if I mess it up? There were multiple cankers on that tree, and I had Bill cut 2 of them. So I actually ended up, I made 2. And the piece of wood, the first one that I used, reminded me very much of a boat, but it was also very vaginal. It turned out that carving was the easy part. How to display it and get my message across became the hard part. The thought behind it was that all of the things that Mother Earth gives us, and so the title of the piece is From Birth to Death, Mother Supports Us. Because the environmental concerns were so large, at this point, my question was, how long will she be able to continue to support us? I kept adding more elements and secret codes and layers of meaning. And through discussion with the group and the curator, I ended up removing most of what I had added and let the voice of the piece speak for itself, with the addition of a very few natural elements that represented some of the gifts from Mother Earth. And now we come to past influences and things that we used to do that maybe we don't do anymore for whatever reason. And so what if I revisited my past and looked at some of the things that I used to do? When I was a child, my mother used to do embroidery on pillowcases, and she would let us do samples on scrap cloths. When I was at college, I used to do a lot of journaling and carried my journal books around in my backpack all the time, which started to get them a bit careworn. And so I started creating bags for them onto which I would stitch something. I stopped journaling quite a while ago when the kids were little because there was absolutely no time to do anything. But a few years ago, I had started journaling again and decided that I would like to make a bag. So here we get back to inspirations from strange places. The image that you see in the lower left-hand corner is the image of wind currents around the South Pole. I found that these lines and their movement were really lovely and wanted to recreate them. So my first stitching here was actually going to be a little bag for a journal. I was going to Halifax in a bus and wanted a small portable project. So this is about 7 hours worth of stitching, and it's only about 12 inches by 4 inches. On the return trip, when we were about an hour away from Fredericton, I got a call from my husband saying that my father-in-law had died. Over the next couple of weeks, I found myself in a car with my husband and brother-in-law as we did a lot of driving to Woodstock to deal with funeral arrangements. All this time, I kept thinking about my father-in-law, who was an amazing and wonderful man. And so this one is entitled Earl. In March of that year, we went to the cottage that Earl had bought back in 1944 when he was on leave from the war. My brother-in-law was there, my family was there, and some friends who have a cottage on the lake were there as well. One fine day, we went out for a walk on the lake. There was a very thin skiff of snow, and after walking a while, I turned around and could see the pathways that showed how people had come together and where someone had gone off to explore and where we had come back together again. I thought that this was a lovely image and metaphor, and I started stitching. I happened to fall in love with stitching and by this time, and one of the things that happens when you fall in love with something is that you want to share it. There was a new call for entry from another Craft NB show called Conversations that was to be about collaborations. So I invited some other fiber artists to join me in a little project to see what we could create if we had the same common set of materials and worked without sharing what we were doing. The only instructions given were just stitch, and we came up with 5 very different interpretations of what it means to us to just stitch. Some were planned and some were not. It was a lovely conversation that we had where everybody brought their own voice to the same set of materials. I enjoy the odd puzzle when I have time. And when we cleaned up my in-laws' house, there was a number of antique puzzles that were hand cut. The pieces were very odd shapes and I found them intriguing. Not only just the shapes, but what was happening in between the shapes. So this piece is about 20 by 40 inches. The black areas are forms based on the puzzle pieces, but once again, what I found so interesting was the areas in between. So I started working with various colored threads and creating these gradation blends, blending from one color into the next. It was a very interesting exercise. And I will say that what I learned from Charlotte really came into play here because she has such a way of color blending that I've been able to closely examine. This was quite a large piece and took me probably 7 or 8 months to finish. I had done another number of other large pieces and very time-consuming pieces, and I was feeling overwhelmed by the amount of time that some of these larger pieces took to complete. I had started another, but then found myself avoiding it. I made plenty of excuses at first, and then thought, what if I was honest with myself? In January 2020, I was headed to St. Andrews, traveling in the car, and wanted some small project to work on that I could finish quickly. I think I was looking for some instant gratification. I grabbed a piece of fabric and my 6-inch hoop and some floss, and I just started stitching. I started with the simple stitched rim and figured I would figure out what to put in the center afterwards. And what came out were the words, "Everything is fine," because in reality everything was not fine. And then the flower losing its petal to show that the words were not necessarily 100% true. This had me thinking about the question, "How are you?" that people automatically ask. Through Facebook, I asked people, what do you say when somebody says, "How are you?" and everything is not fine? I received a lot of answers. Some were the typical fine, some deflected the question, and some were humorous. Some were painfully honest. I stitched most every answer that I was given, including some of my own, and some answers that people had given me when I automatically asked the question. And my small project continued into June. As the project progressed and COVID progressed around the world and everything was really not fine for anyone, it became more relevant. Some of the answers were so amazingly truthful that it almost hurt to stitch them. Some I found that I wanted to stitch the words very large, and other ones were stitched very tiny, almost like it was a whisper. The response that I got from this piece was amazing. I think that many people thought that it was wonderful to see that they were not the only ones not being okay. So I ended up with 53 of these and strung them all together in a series of flags that is over 50 feet long. They are currently on display at UNB Art Center, and the gallery is only open to the public for one more day, which is this Sunday, December 13th from 12 to 5, but you have to register for a time in order to keep the number of people in the gallery at a minimum. So please visit UNB Art Center website to book a time. I love working with words, and recently I started doing some eco-printing, which is a technique where you can print images of leaves onto fabric using natural dyes. I wanted to use some of my prints as a base for stitching, so I decided to continue being truthful and honest and started stitching some of these things that I've been feeling and thinking. These are a few pieces from my latest series, Current Thoughts and Feelings, and I know that I am not alone in some of these feelings. These are quite interesting because when you're far away, you mostly see the prints, and when you get closer, you see the words. As I mentioned, I enjoy journaling. I also enjoy making my own journals, in which the pages are made from different kinds of paper and some are different sizes. I also like to scatter prompts throughout them as I work through my journals. I've come across some of these prompts before at times that I need them. This is the page from my Beneath the Surface journal, which appeared when I was doubting my decisions. And I want to let students know that struggling with concepts or projects is a lifelong thing. Having conversations with someone you trust and who can give you constructive criticism is so helpful. Find your tribe, keep them close, listen to each other, and trust yourself. Thanks.
That's how it's going to get.
I put some time and effort into it.
Bravo, Jackie. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Fantastic. So we'll
open it up. What are your questions, folks? As you were talking, Jackie, people had typed in the little chat window. And so there have been some wonderful responses like, lovely presentation, great job. It's so wonderful. When you were in the process of talking about rocks, of course, Brigitte Clavet was like, you rock, Jackie. She said it was awesome to actually hear about your practice. So yeah, if people would like to come forward with their questions.
I'll do one. Jackie, I found it so interesting to know that you were willed Charlotte's stash of, things. And all of us who collect things that are important to us for our making always worry about that, is it going to end up in good hands? So it's wonderful that it has. There was one detail, because I'm not a weaver, I didn't understand what the significance was. What's a quill, and how did it inspire you?
It's basically just a little piece of paper that you wind yarn around. So with weaving, we usually have bobbins, which are a piece of plastic, but working with tapestry, you don't want it, they have got little ends on them, kind of like a spool of thread. And working with a tapestry, you don't want to have those balls or the large parts on the end. So it's just a piece of paper, like a little tiny tube that you wind the yarn around, and you can put them on your bobbin winder.
And are these the things that she left? Are they ends?
Yeah, so that would just be little bits of, like the scrap bits left over from a quilting project. So bits of yarn that were on, they could still be used for something, but not ready for the garbage yet.
I understand.
But yeah, the project was done, so.
That's so neat.
I could really identify, Jackie, with the story of how you have woven, your child rearing and having a family and your practice in. And for me, they're enmeshed and they're entangled. And I used to spend many of the early years, especially when they were very little, under a lot of sleep deprivation, like kind of almost fantasizing about when I'd have more time. And I learned, I think, to use the small amounts of time like they were expanses of great time, and to kind of build a practice from to just taking those tiny chinks, the little pieces.
Yes.
So it's always wonderful, I think, as a female artist, as a mother, as somebody who also has a family, to hear these stories. And it's so important, because at times, even in my own practice, I felt very isolated in that. And also a little bit of shame, when other people seem to be cruising and they're attaining great things, it's not always, and you feel vulnerable. So I didn't always want to say, I hate that I'm not getting much done right now, because I didn't want to admit that I wasn't getting much done at that point in time. And so I think these stories and your personal narrative reinforce that. It's like, actually, this is a way, and it's not that nothing is being done, but things are enmeshed and they're being woven throughout life, right? Which is really quite beautiful. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, 5 minutes, a bunch of 5 minutes gives you an hour. I remember when I first started spinning, put the pot of water on to boil, and then I would go and spin for 10 minutes and then go back and finish making supper, just because it was a tiny little block of time in which I could get something done. And that is one of the things that I really like about textiles, is that for the most part, it's not time sensitive. You can put it down, come back to it whenever you have time again, whether it be in 5 minutes or in some instances 5 years or even longer. So yeah, I enjoy that aspect of textiles. Always have. But yes, now that the kids are older, I've got larger blocks of time. It's lovely.
Jackie, I just wanted to say I loved the honesty of your presentation. Thank you for that. That it's not always easy and sailing through and confident, but you just what if, and you try and you do and produce great work from it. Thanks for that.
You're welcome. Yeah, well, I was thinking this is, mostly for students, so it's not always going to be smooth sailing. There are going to be times when you're going to get rejected from stuff. There are going to be times when you have self-doubts. I would love to know the person that doesn't have self-doubts from time to time. I think it's important for growth to doubt yourself occasionally, examine yourself, figure out what you could possibly, yeah, what am I doing? Am I doing the right thing? As opposed to always knowing that you're doing the right thing and not questioning what you're doing. That makes sense. Ramble. No other questions? Anybody? Oh, yes, Kifa. I've got a question from the back of the room. Right. So Keith just said that a lot of my pieces took a lot of time and wanted me to talk a little bit more about that. I apparently like to come up with big projects. So, and sometimes it's just the only way that my vision can come out. I could do something small, but it's not going to work the same. So and I don't mind actually taking the time. Usually most of my work happens in evenings on weekends because I'm here all week or during the summertime. And I will just sit. I watch a lot of YouTube, a lot of videos, lots of Netflix. A lot of times rewatch things that I don't really have to pay attention to or I'm not really engaged in. It's just sort of the background thing. And I'll just work. So making those decisions on the fly, like Sherry Lynn was talking about. So yeah, I don't mind that aspect of it. Coming up with new ideas all the time. I have a whole bunch of new ideas, but I think it's just the matter that I wanted to do these big things. I didn't necessarily start out to do something that took 8 months, but that's just what happened. It just took 8 months. And so I just went with it. And, you know, while I'm doing that, I was obviously, especially the Newfoundland rocks, I was obviously thinking about other things because that wasn't the only project that I did. And I didn't do that, you know, 8 hours a day. It was, you know, a few hours every night. So maybe 10, 15, 20 hours in a week to work on one thing. And then there might be some weeks where I was working more, some weeks when I was working less. But that long tapestry that I did with Charlotte's leftovers was, it was amazing how intensely focused that was and how, because that was like 8 to 10 hour days sitting and weaving. That's all that I did. Like, I'm hungry, go get a piece of cheese or get yourself a bowl of cereal or whatever. And I just focused on that, and I would get up and do something and I would just find myself drawn back to the loom, and I had to weave. Do you want to? No, I'm weaving. And just really enjoying the process of going through all of those things and thinking about Charlotte and how great she was, and learning so much. It really amazed me how much I learned just from looking at what she had done, like these little bobbins that were, you know, essentially leftover bits that were scattered throughout all over yarn, but there was so much information that I learned from there and things that I, you know, I didn't even realize until later.
Jackie, Visha Plume had an interesting question. Visha, would you like to voice that question yourself?
Jackie, I was impressed that you work solo on your own, but you also work in collaboration. And sometimes collaborations with people you know, but sometimes collaborations that are open to the, you know, Facebook world and internet world. I'm wondering what you gain most from the collaborations.
Basically, it's just people's input. So I've done this a number of times because everybody's minds work differently, and I find it fascinating when everybody can look at the same thing and see something different. So there have been a number of times when I have asked the question, you know, this is for just a question, a research question. What do you, like, for example, the how are you? That was a great one. What do you say? And everybody has different answers because I've got 3 or 4 pat answers that I usually use. But there are some that came at me and I thought, oh, wow. the ones that really got me were the really painfully honest ones. Like, I'm human garbage. Like, I would never, ever say that to someone or even necessarily think it. But it's one of the ones that people say, wow, that's amazing. So it's just, I get the ideas from other people's brains, because everybody's brains work differently. So that's what I get from asking a question like that on Facebook. And there are some that, if I really didn't, it didn't really fit, or they weren't really answering the question, then I wouldn't necessarily include, but most of them went in.
And can I ask a follow-up?
Absolutely.
I'm just wondering how that changes when you had like the stitching project where you had people that you knew that you were stitching with.
So I had a fair amount of black silk noil, and so I gave everyone the same size silk noil, and everyone the same 10 colors of floss. And it was, do you want to play this game with me for this show? And they said yes. So it was interesting. We had conversations. Are you working? Yes. How's it going? Oh, it's going well. But we weren't talking about what we were doing at all, because I wanted everyone to work within their own little private bubble. And everybody seemed to agree that that was great and wanted to go along with that. So it was nice, once again, to see how different people interpreted these materials with the instructions of just stitch. And when we were, having conversations at the very first of this project, a number of them said, well, what if can I? And I would say just stitch. Or what about it's just stitch? And so anytime anybody asked me a question, I would just repeat, the instructions are just stitch. So it was nice to see different people's interpretations of what that meant with the same set of materials, because they were quite different. Everybody had a very different idea of what it meant, and what they brought to it. I sometimes don't mind. There are some things that I don't mind giving up control over. Like, I have given people some pieces for shows where very specific instructions, but other times I've handed them, well, for example, the long piece that was in the George Fry Gallery, the timeline of mine and Grace's time together, where I handed it to Brigitte and Karen and said, have fun, do what you want with it. It's 40 feet long. And I enjoy other people's vision of what my piece should look like. So sometimes I don't mind giving up control. And I think the How Are You flags are the same thing. Like, they are up at the UND Art Center right now. I haven't actually seen it myself. I'm going to be there on Sunday, gallery sitting from 2 until 3:30. So I will get to see them, but I don't know how they hung them up. So I'd be interested, because I had nothing to do with the hanging of that show. I'll be interested to see how they hung them. They were hung differently. I hung them here. They were different at Created Here space. I don't mind giving up some control to other people sometimes.
So you're a true collaborator, Jackie. I often think that people misuse that word, because when they say collaboration, what they mean is you're going to cooperate with me and be complacent or do what I want to do. So, at the heart of a true collaborator is there's a space for everybody and a willingness to give and take. Yeah. It is 1 o'clock. And so I wanted to kind of bring it back in and to say thank you so much for your very rich and generous sharing of your practice, and for being so honest about your journey. And I think the one thing, if I look at what you have shown, is that you have immense tenacity in it, that you are just continuing with your work. And so it's wonderful to see that conviction. So thank you, Jackie. Thanks to everybody for attending. Today is actually our last talk of the season. And so just before you log out, I really would like to say a special thank you to the Sheila Hugh Mackay Foundation for sponsoring this, in particular to Catherine McCarroll for all her work and help, to the Atlantic Centre for Creativity and Mary Bladwick. Thank you so much. It's been a privilege to host this and partner with them. to Johnny LaRue, Mary Stewart, Tony Merzetti, Casey Burkholder, Danielle Hogan, Gillian Dykeman, Thaddeus Halonia, Charlie Gaffney, Gillian Akerman, Elizabeth Demerson, Tracy Austin, Peter Thomas, and yourself, Jackie Bourque, today. Thank you so much. And you know, it's nice, we do this as a college, we do this as a program, but like all programs and institutes, they are simply made up of the people themselves who are the greatest, you know, attribute that we have. And so to my advanced studio practice students, Alison Fitzgerald, Jody Haley, Audrey Arsenault, Ben Elder Gomez, Lee McLean, pardon me, Amy MacDonald, and Tracy O'Brien. Thank you so much for making this series such a success. And to finish up, I'm going to tell you a little story before you all go. So Jackie, I know you lost a beautiful sister and you showed us that slideshow of visiting her in England to celebrate. And I had been thinking of my own sister this Christmas and missing people from home, not being able to be there. And before my sister passed away, she gifted me with a beautiful silver ring, which I would wear daily. And that piece of jewelry was gone. And I was really feeling at a loss that, oh my gosh, I feel such a loss of connection with people right now, and in particular with her. And I had a student arrive yesterday who gifted me with these. So what you're looking at is a set of beaded earrings by Julie Sabattus. And Julie is alumni from the Indigenous Visual Arts program here at the college. She was a student here 6 years ago and randomly showed up in the foyer yesterday and said, look what I found in my beading basket. And I was reduced to tears. I just cried and wept. Like, she had no idea that I had lost that significant piece of jewelry that I carry on my body every day. And I wasn't even aware that she knew this story of my sister, Terry. And so I think that you've spoken about Charlotte Glen Cross today and of these really amazing sisters and women in our lives who pass on the stories, pass on the craft, pass on the knowledge. And so I think it's a good way to end by, I guess, wishing everybody happy holidays, whatever you're celebrating yourself, and hoping that those connections will thrive and that you will feel connected, even with people beyond the veil. Yeah, and so thank you, Jackie, and good luck to everybody. Have a safe and healthy holidays.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.